In the summer of 1943, a group of young American recruits gathered around their barracks, laughing until their sides hurt. They had just pulled off what they thought was the perfect prank on their strict commanding officer, Colonel James Mitchell. The recruits believed they had outsmarted the old warhorse, making him look foolish in front of the entire company. But what these 18 and 19-year-old boys didn't know was that their harmless joke had just exposed a deadly Nazi spy ring that had been operating right under their noses for months. The same prank that made them giggle like schoolchildren had unknowingly saved hundreds of Allied lives and changed the course of a critical World War II operation. Colonel Mitchell stood at his office window that evening, watching the recruits celebrate their supposed victory. He couldn't tell them the truth, not yet. He couldn't explain that their childish prank had just helped him identify the most dangerous enemy agent his intelligence network had been hunting for over a year. The recruits thought they were funny. The colonel knew they were heroes, even if they would never know it. This is the true story of how a simple, practical joke became one of the most important counterintelligence breakthroughs of the war, and how ordinary young men accidentally became the key to stopping a plot that could have killed thousands of American soldiers. The bus wheezed to a stop outside Camp Harrison on a sweltering Tuesday morning in June 1943. Dust clouds swirled around 23 young recruits as they stepped onto the Georgia soil, their civilian clothes already soaked with sweat and nervousness. Among them was Tommy Rodriguez from Brooklyn, whose mother had packed him 3 extra pairs of socks and a rosary. There was Billy Thompson from rural Iowa, who had never seen so many people from different places in his entire life. And there was Marcus Washington from Detroit, whose father had served in the Great War and told him stories that both inspired and terrified him. The camp itself looked like something from a movie to these young men. Rows of identical wooden barracks stretched across the red dirt landscape. American flags snapped in the humid breeze, and the sound of marching feet echoed from somewhere beyond the mess hall. This was where boys would become soldiers, where farmhands and city kids would learn to fight a war that seemed both very far away and dangerously close. Colonel James Mitchell watched the new arrivals from his office window on the second floor of the headquarters building. At 52 years old, he was a career military man who had served in France during World War I. His grey hair was perfectly trimmed, his uniform pressed to sharp creases, and his reputation among the recruits was that of a man who could spot a dirty button from 50 yards away. But what the young soldiers didn't know was that Colonel Mitchell was much more than a strict disciplinarian. He was also a highly trained intelligence officer who had been assigned to Camp Harrison for reasons that had nothing to do with training new recruits. For the past 6 months, Allied intelligence had been picking up disturbing signals. Radio transmissions were being intercepted that suggested enemy agents were operating near several American training facilities. The information being passed along was detailed and dangerous. Troop movements, training schedules, weapon shipments, and even personal information about officers were somehow making their way to German intelligence networks. Someone with access to highly classified information was betraying his country, and Camp Harrison was one of the suspected locations. The new recruits spent their first week learning the basics. They were issued uniforms that never seemed to fit quite right, boots that gave them blisters, and equipment that was heavier than anything they had ever carried. Tommy Rodriguez discovered that Brooklyn street smarts didn't help much when it came to making a bed tight enough to bounce a quarter. Billy Thompson learnt that Iowa farm strength was useful, but not when you were trying to disassemble a rifle with fingers that shook from exhaustion. Marcus Washington found that listening to his father's war stories was very different from actually living through basic training. The day started before sunrise with the harsh sound of reveille played over crackling speakers. The recruits would tumble out of their narrow bunks, struggle into their uniforms, and stumble outside for morning exercises. They ran miles through the Georgia heat, did push-ups until their arms gave out, and learned to march in formation without tripping over each other. After breakfast, there were classes on military procedure, weapons training, and endless drills that tested their patience and endurance. Colonel Mitchell made a point of observing these training sessions personally. He would appear unexpectedly during rifle practice, walking the line of nervous recruits with his hands clasped behind his back. He attended classroom sessions on military strategy, standing quietly in the back while instructors explained battlefield tactics. To the recruits, it seemed like the colonel was everywhere, watching everything, looking for any excuse to find fault with their performance. But Colonel Mitchell was actually watching for something much more specific. He was looking for patterns, inconsistencies, and behavior that might indicate someone was paying too much attention to the wrong things. Intelligence work had taught him that enemy agents often revealed themselves through small details. They might ask too many questions about schedules, or show unusual interest in information that wasn't directly related to their duties. They might make phone calls at odd hours, receive mail from unexpected sources, or display knowledge that they shouldn't logically possess. During the second week of training, the recruits were introduced to their drill sergeants, the non-commissioned officers who would be responsible for turning them into soldiers. Sergeant Mike O'Brien was a tough Irishman from Boston who had served in the Pacific and had no patience for mistakes or excuses. Sergeant Carlos Mendez had fought in North Africa and spoke 3 languages fluently. And Sergeant Robert Kim was a quiet man from California whose family had been forced into internment camps, but who had still volunteered to serve his country. These drill sergeants were carefully chosen by Colonel Mitchell for reasons beyond their military experience. All 3 men had been briefed about the security situation at Camp Harrison and were trained to watch for suspicious behavior among both recruits and staff. They knew how to ask casual questions that might reveal important information, and they understood how to report their observations without attracting attention. The training became more intense as the days passed. The recruits learned to handle weapons, navigate using maps and compasses, and work together as a unit. They practiced combat techniques, studied enemy tactics, and learned to follow orders without question. But they also began to develop the camaraderie that was essential for survival in combat. Tommy, Billy, and Marcus became close friends, sharing their fears, hopes, and dreams during the few quiet moments they had each day. It was during the 3rd week that the first incident occurred. Tommy Rodriguez was walking past the headquarters building one evening when he noticed someone in an officer's uniform talking on a telephone near an open window. The conversation was quiet, but Tommy could hear enough to know that whoever was speaking was discussing troop movements and training schedules. What struck Tommy as odd was that the person was speaking in what sounded like a foreign language, though he couldn't identify exactly what it was. Tommy mentioned this to Billy and Marcus the next day, but they didn't think much of it. There were officers at Camp Harrison from many different backgrounds, and it wasn't unusual for someone to speak a foreign language. Besides, they were too busy trying to survive their own training to worry about what the officers were doing. They had rifle practice, night marches, and written examinations that determined whether they would advance to the next phase of training. But Colonel Mitchell was very interested when Sergeant O'Brien reported Tommy's observation during their weekly briefing. Foreign language conversations near headquarters were exactly the kind of detail that intelligence officers were trained to investigate. The colonel made a note to increase surveillance around the headquarters building and to pay closer attention to which officers had access to sensitive information. As the recruits entered their 4th week of training, they began to feel more confident and comfortable with camp life. They had learned the routines, mastered the basic skills, and started to think of themselves as real soldiers. This growing confidence also made them more observant of their surroundings and more willing to talk about things they noticed. It was Marcus Washington who made the next important observation. During a late-night fire watch duty, he saw someone in civilian clothes meeting with a uniformed officer behind the motor pool. The meeting lasted only a few minutes, but Marcus noticed that something changed hands between the 2 men. It looked like an envelope or small package, but Marcus was too far away to see clearly. When Marcus told his friends about this incident, they began to realize that there might be more going on at Camp Harrison than just basic military training. Tommy's foreign language conversation, Marcus's midnight meeting, and several other small incidents they had witnessed began to form a pattern that made them uncomfortable. Billy Thompson, who had always been the most cautious of the 3 friends, suggested that they should report what they had seen to their drill sergeant. But the others were reluctant to get involved in something they didn't understand. They were still new recruits who were just trying to make it through training without getting into trouble. Colonel Mitchell, meanwhile, was piecing together information from multiple sources. Radio intercepts, surveillance reports, and observations from his trusted personnel were beginning to paint a picture of organized espionage activity. Someone at Camp Harrison was systematically collecting and transmitting classified information to enemy agents outside the base. The challenge was that the spy or spies were being extremely careful. They were using code words, meeting at irregular intervals, and communicating through channels that were difficult to monitor. Traditional counterintelligence methods were not providing the breakthrough that Colonel Mitchell needed to identify and stop the security breach. What the colonel didn't know was that the solution to his problem would come from the most unexpected source imaginable. 3 young recruits who thought they were just playing a harmless prank would inadvertently provide the key to exposing the most dangerous enemy agent his intelligence network had been hunting for over a year. The idea came to Tommy Rodriguez during a particularly brutal training exercise in the 4th week. The recruits had been crawling through mud under barbed wire for what felt like hours while Sergeant O'Brien shouted instructions and Colonel Mitchell watched from a nearby observation post. Tommy's uniform was soaked with sweat and Georgia red clay. His knees were scraped raw, and his patience with military authority was wearing thin. As he lay on his belly waiting for the next whistle blast, Tommy noticed that Colonel Mitchell had left his clipboard on a wooden crate while he walked over to speak with another officer. The clipboard contained what looked like training schedules, duty rosters, and other routine paperwork. But to 18-year-old Tommy, it represented something much more significant. It represented authority, rules, and everything about military life that made him feel small and powerless. That evening in the barracks, Tommy shared his observation with Billy and Marcus. The three friends had grown closer during their weeks of training, bound together by shared hardships and the natural camaraderie that develops between young men facing uncertainty together. They spent their few free minutes each day talking about home, complaining about drill sergeants, and dreaming about what they would do when the war was over. Billy Thompson had always been something of a practical joker back home in Iowa. He was the kind of person who could make people laugh even in difficult situations. And his sense of humor had helped keep the group's spirits up during the toughest parts of training. When Tommy mentioned seeing Colonel Mitchell's clipboard unattended, Billy's eyes lit up with mischievous possibility. Marcus Washington was normally the voice of caution among the three friends. His father's military experience had taught him to respect authority and follow orders without question. But even Marcus was feeling frustrated with the constant pressure and criticism from their instructors. The idea of doing something that would make them feel like they had some small measure of control was appealing, even if it was risky. The plan they developed was simple and, they thought, harmless. During the next training exercise, one of them would create a distraction, while another would temporarily take Colonel Mitchell's clipboard and replace some of the official documents with fake ones they would create themselves. The fake documents would be obviously ridiculous, designed to make the colonel look foolish when he tried to use them. After the colonel discovered the prank, they would return the real documents and claim it was all just a joke meant to boost morale. Spending the next several days preparing their prank, the three recruits worked during their limited free time to create fake training schedules that were absurdly impossible. They wrote orders for midnight inspections of non-existent equipment, training exercises that would require recruits to march backwards while singing patriotic songs, and duty assignments that put people in 3 different places at the same time. To their 18-year-old minds, these fake documents were hilarious proof of their cleverness. Billy used his artistic skills to forge Colonel Mitchell's signature and create official-looking letterhead using materials he had borrowed from the camp's administrative officers. Tommy contributed his knowledge of military terminology learned during their classes, making sure the fake documents sounded authentic enough to be believable at first glance. Marcus helped by keeping watch and making sure their activities weren't observed by drill sergeants or other personnel. What the 3 young men didn't know was that their preparations had been noticed by someone who was very interested in their activities. Captain Richard Hoffman was a staff officer who had been assigned to Camp Harrison 6 months earlier. He was responsible for coordinating training schedules, managing supplies, and handling administrative duties that kept the base running smoothly. He was also, unknown to anyone except his German handlers, a highly trained enemy agent who had been gathering intelligence about American military operations for over 2 years. Captain Hoffman had infiltrated the United States Army using forged documents and a carefully constructed identity. His real name was Klaus Heinrich, and he was a graduate of the German Military Intelligence Academy who specialized in long-term deep cover operations. He spoke perfect English with no trace of an accent, understood American culture and customs, and had the kind of friendly, competent personality that made people trust him instinctively. For months, Captain Hoffman had been carefully collecting information about Camp Harrison's operations. He photographed training manuals, copied personnel files, and documented weapon shipments and troop movements. He transmitted this information to his handlers using a sophisticated radio hidden in his private quarters, communicating in code during predetermined time windows when his signals would be less likely to be detected. But Captain Hoffman's greatest asset was his ability to observe and analyze human behavior. His intelligence training had taught him to recognize patterns, identify opportunities, and exploit weaknesses in security systems. When he noticed 3 young recruits spending unusual amounts of time working on what appeared to be forged documents, he immediately recognized the potential value of their activities. The opportunity that Captain Hoffman saw was brilliant in its simplicity. If he could somehow gain access to Colonel Mitchell's real documents during the recruit's prank, he could photograph or copy highly classified information without anyone suspecting his involvement. The recruits would be blamed for any security breach, and his own activities would remain completely hidden. Captain Hoffman began monitoring the 3 friends more closely, learning their schedules and identifying when they might attempt their prank. He noticed that Tommy Rodriguez had developed a habit of observing Colonel Mitchell during training exercises, that Billy Thompson had been asking casual questions about administrative procedures, and that Marcus Washington was becoming increasingly nervous about their plan. The opportunity came during a comprehensive field exercise designed to test everything the recruits had learned during their first month of training. Companies of new soldiers were spread across several miles of Georgia countryside, practicing tactics that simulated real combat conditions. Officers and drill sergeants moved between different groups, observing performance and providing guidance. Colonel Mitchell was particularly busy during this exercise, moving from location to location with his usual clipboard of documents. But these weren't the routine training schedules that Tommy had seen before. They were highly classified materials related to the security investigation that Colonel Mitchell was conducting. The documents included surveillance reports, intercept summaries, and analysis of suspected espionage activities at Camp Harrison. Tommy Rodriguez saw his chance when Colonel Mitchell stopped to observe a group of recruits practicing river crossing techniques. The colonel placed his clipboard on the hood of a jeep and walked down to the water's edge to get a better view of the exercise. Billy Thompson created the planned distraction by accidentally falling into the river and calling for help in a voice loud enough to attract everyone's attention. While Colonel Mitchell and the drill sergeants rushed to assist Billy, who was in no actual danger but was making a great show of struggling in the shallow water, Tommy quickly approached the jeep and grabbed the clipboard. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it, but the commotion at the river covered any noise he might have made. Marcus Washington was positioned nearby to provide early warning if anyone approached, but he was so nervous that he could barely breathe. Watching Tommy switch the documents felt like the longest moment of his young life. He kept expecting someone to shout an alarm, or for military police to appear from nowhere to arrest them all, but the switch was completed without incident. Tommy replaced Colonel Mitchell's real documents with their carefully prepared fakes and returned the clipboard to its position on the jeep hood. Billy managed to get out of the river with appropriate dignity, claiming that he had slipped on a wet rock but was perfectly fine. The entire operation took less than 3 minutes. What none of the 3 recruits realized was that Captain Hoffman had been watching the entire incident from a concealed position about 50 yards away. He had anticipated their plan and positioned himself to observe their prank without being detected. As soon as Tommy completed the document switch, Captain Hoffman moved quickly to intercept him. Approaching Tommy with a friendly smile and speaking in a quiet, authoritative voice, Captain Hoffman identified himself and explained that he had witnessed their prank. He told Tommy that while he appreciated the humor involved, what they had done was technically a serious breach of military discipline that could result in court-martial charges. Tommy's face went white with fear. The possibility of serious punishment had always been in the back of his mind, but Captain Hoffman's calm explanation made the consequences seem terrifyingly real. Court-martial meant disgrace, imprisonment, and the end of any chance to serve his country honorably. His mother would be devastated, and his friends would suffer the same fate because of his stupid idea. But Captain Hoffman quickly reassured Tommy that he wasn't planning to report the incident to Colonel Mitchell. Instead, he suggested that they could resolve the situation quietly, if Tommy would simply show him the real documents that had been taken from the clipboard. He explained that he needed to verify that nothing truly sensitive had been compromised before deciding how to handle the situation. Grateful for what seemed like a second chance, Tommy immediately produced the real documents from his jacket pocket. He handed them to Captain Hoffman, who glanced through them quickly while explaining that this was just a routine security check. Captain Hoffman told Tommy to wait exactly 10 minutes before returning the documents to Colonel Mitchell's clipboard, giving him time to complete his review. What Tommy couldn't see was that Captain Hoffman was photographing each document with a tiny camera concealed in his uniform. The classified materials that Colonel Mitchell had been carrying included detailed information about the ongoing security investigation, including lists of suspected individuals, surveillance schedules, and counterintelligence strategies. In less than 5 minutes, Captain Hoffman had obtained intelligence information that would normally have taken months of careful espionage work to acquire. The recruit's innocent prank had provided him with exactly the kind of access he needed to stay ahead of the investigation that was closing in on his activities. After returning the documents to Tommy with instructions to put them back exactly as they had been found, Captain Hoffman walked away with a friendly warning about avoiding future pranks that could cause serious trouble. Tommy was so relieved to escape punishment that he didn't question why a staff officer would be personally involved in handling such a minor incident. When Colonel Mitchell returned to his jeep and picked up his clipboard, he immediately noticed that something was wrong. The documents were in the wrong order, and there were papers included that he had never seen before. The fake training schedules were so obviously ridiculous that he recognized them as pranks within seconds. But Colonel Mitchell's intelligence training also told him that this incident was far more significant than a simple practical joke. Someone had gained access to highly classified counterintelligence materials, even if only briefly. The timing and method suggested either remarkable coincidence or enemy action designed to appear innocent. Colonel Mitchell stood beside his jeep, staring at the ridiculous fake documents with a mixture of amusement and alarm. The training schedule that ordered recruits to practice marching while balancing eggs on their heads would have been funny under different circumstances. But the fact that someone had been able to access and temporarily remove highly classified counterintelligence materials was anything but amusing. His first instinct was to immediately question everyone who had been in the area during the exercise. Military protocol demanded that security breaches be investigated thoroughly and quickly, regardless of whether they appeared to be accidents or pranks. But Colonel Mitchell's intelligence experience told him that an immediate investigation might actually make the situation worse. If enemy agents were operating at Camp Harrison, and if they had somehow been involved in this incident, then a dramatic response would warn them that their activities had been detected. The colonel needed to gather information carefully and quietly, without alerting potential spies that they were under suspicion. Instead of calling for military police or launching a formal investigation, Colonel Mitchell decided to handle the situation personally. He carefully examined the fake documents, noting the quality of the forgery, the accuracy of the military terminology, and the level of planning that had obviously gone into creating them. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment prank by bored recruits. Someone had spent considerable time and effort preparing these materials. Over the next 2 days, Colonel Mitchell quietly interviewed the drill sergeants and officers who had been present during the field exercise. He asked casual questions about what they had observed, who had been in various locations at specific times, and whether they had noticed anything unusual. He was looking for patterns and inconsistencies that might reveal how the document switch had been accomplished. Sergeant O'Brien provided the first important clue. He remembered that Private Rodriguez had been acting nervous during the river crossing exercise, and that Private Thompson had fallen into the water in what seemed like an unnecessarily dramatic fashion. He also recalled seeing Private Washington positioned where he could observe both the river and the area where Colonel Mitchell had left his jeep. But Sergeant O'Brien also reported something else that caught Colonel Mitchell's attention. He had seen Captain Hoffman talking quietly with Private Rodriguez shortly after the river incident. This conversation had struck him as unusual, because staff officers didn't normally have individual discussions with new recruits during training exercises. Colonel Mitchell knew Captain Hoffman well, or thought he did. The man had been assigned to Camp Harrison 6 months earlier, with excellent credentials, and had quickly proven himself to be competent and reliable. He handled administrative duties efficiently, got along well with other officers, and seemed genuinely dedicated to supporting the training mission. But intelligence work had taught Colonel Mitchell to be suspicious of people who seemed too perfect. Enemy agents often made the mistake of trying to be more American than Americans, more military than career soldiers, and more trustworthy than anyone had a right to expect. Captain Hoffman's perfect record and friendly personality could be genuine, or they could be carefully constructed elements of a false identity. Colonel Mitchell decided to investigate Captain Hoffman's background more thoroughly. He began by reviewing the personnel file that had been provided when the captain was assigned to Camp Harrison. The document showed that Richard Hoffman had been born in Pennsylvania, educated at a state university, and commissioned as an officer through the Reserve Officer Training Corps program. His service record included positive evaluations from previous assignments and no indication of security concerns. But when Colonel Mitchell used his intelligence contacts to verify these records more deeply, he began to find small discrepancies that were troubling. The university had no record of a Richard Hoffman graduating in the year listed in his file. The previous commanding officers who had supposedly written positive evaluations claimed they had never heard of him. The address listed as his family home in Pennsylvania turned out to be a vacant lot. These discoveries were disturbing enough to warrant immediate action, but Colonel Mitchell faced a delicate problem. If Captain Hoffman was indeed an enemy agent, then confronting him directly would likely result in his disappearance before any useful information could be obtained. Intelligence networks were designed to protect their operatives through rapid extraction when they were compromised. What Colonel Mitchell needed was evidence of Captain Hoffman's espionage activities, not just proof that his identity was false. He needed to catch the man in the act of collecting or transmitting intelligence information. This would require careful surveillance and probably some form of trap that would force Captain Hoffman to reveal his true purposes. The breakthrough came when Colonel Mitchell realized that the recruit's prank might actually provide the perfect opportunity to expose Captain Hoffman's activities. If the captain was indeed a spy, then he would be extremely interested in any intelligence information that had been compromised during the document switch. He would want to know exactly what classified materials the recruits had seen, and whether they represented a threat to his own security. Colonel Mitchell developed a plan that was risky but potentially very effective. He would use the three recruits as unwitting bait to draw Captain Hoffman into revealing his true nature. The plan required careful preparation and precise timing, but it offered the best chance of gathering the evidence needed to stop the espionage activities at Camp Harrison. The first step was to quietly interview the three recruits involved in the prank. Colonel Mitchell called them to his office individually, explaining that he needed to understand exactly what had happened during the field exercise. He told each young man that while their prank was a serious breach of discipline, he was more interested in making sure no genuine security violations had occurred. Tommy Rodriguez was terrified when he was called to the colonel's office. He expected to be arrested, court-martialed, and sent to military prison. Instead, he found Colonel Mitchell to be surprisingly understanding and reasonable. The colonel explained that pranks were a normal part of military life, that this particular incident had involved classified materials that required careful handling. When Colonel Mitchell asked Tommy to describe exactly what had happened, the young recruit provided a detailed account that was both honest and revealing. He explained how the prank had been planned, how the document switch had been accomplished, and how Captain Hoffman had intercepted him afterward. Tommy's description of his conversation with Captain Hoffman was particularly interesting to Colonel Mitchell. According to Tommy, the captain had seemed very interested in seeing the real documents and had spent several minutes examining them carefully. He had also asked specific questions about whether Tommy had read or understood any of the classified information. Billy Thompson's interview provided additional details about the planning and execution of the prank. He described how they had created the fake documents, practiced the timing of their distraction, and coordinated their activities to avoid detection. He also mentioned that Captain Hoffman had approached him later that same day to ask casual questions about what he had seen during the exercise. Marcus Washington's interview was the most revealing of all. His natural caution had made him particularly observant during the prank, and he had noticed details that his friends had missed. He reported that Captain Hoffman had been positioned where he could observe their activities before the document switch occurred, suggesting that the captain's involvement might not have been as accidental as it had seemed. More importantly, Marcus had observed Captain Hoffman handling the real documents in a way that seemed unusual. Instead of simply glancing through them as he had claimed, the captain had spent time examining each page carefully and had held them in positions that suggested he might have been photographing them. Based on these interviews, Colonel Mitchell became convinced that Captain Hoffman was indeed the enemy agent he had been hunting. The man had clearly used the recruit's prank as an opportunity to gain access to classified counterintelligence materials. Now the colonel needed to prove it in a way that would lead to the capture of the entire spy network. The trap that Colonel Mitchell designed was elegant in its simplicity. He would create false intelligence documents that contained information designed to force Captain Hoffman into taking specific actions that would reveal his espionage activities. If the captain was really a spy, he would be unable to resist transmitting this information to his handlers. The false documents described a fictional Allied operation called Operation Lighthouse that supposedly involved the secret transfer of experimental weapons through Camp Harrison. The operation was scheduled to occur within the next 2 weeks, and the documents included detailed information about troop movements, security procedures, and the nature of the weapons being transferred. To make the trap effective, Colonel Mitchell needed to ensure that Captain Hoffman would have access to these false documents in a way that appeared natural and unsuspicious. The solution was to use the same method that had worked during the recruit's prank, but in reverse. Colonel Mitchell arranged for another field training exercise that would put him in the same area where the original document switch had occurred. This time, however, he would deliberately leave his clipboard unattended with the false Operation Lighthouse documents clearly visible. If Captain Hoffman was monitoring his activities, the spy would likely attempt to access these documents just as he had done during the recruit's prank. But Colonel Mitchell also needed to be able to observe Captain Hoffman's actions without being detected. He arranged for a team of military police investigators to be positioned in concealed locations around the training area. These men were experienced in surveillance techniques and would be able to document any attempt to access or photograph the classified materials. The exercise was scheduled for the following Thursday, exactly 1 week after the original prank. Colonel Mitchell briefed his surveillance team carefully, making sure they understood that their target was a highly trained enemy agent who would be watching for signs of a trap. The operation would succeed only if Captain Hoffman believed that he was taking advantage of another accidental opportunity. As the day of the operation approached, Colonel Mitchell found himself hoping that his analysis of the situation had been correct. If Captain Hoffman was innocent, then the trap would simply prove that fact without causing any harm. But if the man was indeed a spy, then this operation could lead to the capture of intelligence information that might save hundreds or thousands of Allied lives. The three recruits who had unknowingly started this chain of events were completely unaware that their prank had become the centerpiece of a major counterintelligence operation. They continued their training, assuming that their brush with serious trouble was over, and that they had somehow escaped punishment for their harmless joke. Tommy Rodriguez, Billy Thompson, and Marcus Washington had no idea that they were about to become unwitting witnesses to one of the most important spy captures of World War II. Thursday morning dawned grey and humid, with thick clouds promising rain before the day was over. The weather seemed appropriate for what Colonel Mitchell knew would be one of the most important operations of his intelligence career. As he prepared for the day's field exercise, he checked his equipment one final time, making sure that every detail of the trap had been planned perfectly. The false Operation Lighthouse documents were carefully prepared to look authentic while containing information that would be irresistible to an enemy agent. Colonel Mitchell had worked with experts from Allied intelligence to create materials that described a fictional weapons transfer that would appear to be of enormous strategic value to German forces. According to the false documents, a convoy of trucks would arrive at Camp Harrison in 10 days carrying experimental radio-guided bombs that could be directed to their targets from aircraft flying safely beyond the range of enemy anti-aircraft guns. The weapons were supposedly being transferred from a secret research facility to ships waiting at a nearby port, where they would be transported to England for use in bombing raids against German industrial targets. The documents included detailed information about convoy routes, security procedures, personnel assignments, and technical specifications for the experimental weapons. To an enemy agent, this intelligence would represent an opportunity to either steal incredibly valuable technology or destroy it before it could be used against German forces. But the most important element of the trap was the timing. The documents indicated that the weapons convoy would arrive at Camp Harrison on a Sunday evening when normal base activities would be reduced. Security would supposedly be lighter than usual because military planners wanted to avoid attracting attention to the transfer. This information would force Captain Hoffman to act quickly if he wanted to take advantage of the opportunity. The field exercise that would serve as cover for the trap involved advanced combat training for recruits who had completed their basic military preparation. Companies of soldiers would practice coordinated attacks, defensive positions, and communication procedures that simulated real battlefield conditions. The exercise area covered several square miles of Georgia countryside, providing multiple locations where surveillance teams could be positioned without being detected. Colonel Mitchell's surveillance team consisted of 6 military police investigators who had been specially trained in counterintelligence operations. Each man was equipped with cameras, communication equipment, and detailed maps of the exercise area. They had been briefed on Captain Hoffman's appearance and behavior patterns, and they understood that their target was highly trained and potentially dangerous. The team leader was Master Sergeant William Hayes, a veteran of military police operations, who had worked on espionage cases in both Europe and the Pacific. His experience had taught him that successful surveillance required patience, attention to detail, and the ability to remain invisible even when positioned close to the target. Sergeant Hayes positioned his team in locations that provided clear observation of the area where Colonel Mitchell would be conducting his part of the exercise. Each surveillance position was carefully chosen to remain concealed, while allowing good sightlines and photographic opportunities. The men were instructed to document everything they observed, regardless of whether it seemed immediately relevant to the operation. At exactly 9 o'clock that morning, Colonel Mitchell arrived at the designated exercise area, carrying his clipboard of classified documents. He made a point of handling the materials in a way that would make them clearly visible to anyone who might be watching from a distance. The fake Operation Lighthouse papers were positioned on top of the stack, with their classification markings and official letterhead easy to see. The exercise began with Colonel Mitchell observing recruit training activities while moving between different locations in the area. He followed the same pattern of behavior he had established during previous exercises, placing his clipboard on convenient surfaces while he walked closer to observe specific training activities. Captain Hoffman arrived at the exercise area about 30 minutes after Colonel Mitchell, which was consistent with his normal duties as a staff officer responsible for coordinating training support. He appeared to be conducting routine administrative activities, checking on equipment and supplies that were being used during the exercise. But Master Sergeant Hayes immediately noticed that Captain Hoffman's movement patterns were not random. The man was systematically positioning himself where he could observe Colonel Mitchell's activities without appearing to do so deliberately. This behavior was exactly what the surveillance team had been instructed to watch for. At 10:45, Colonel Mitchell placed his clipboard on the hood of a jeep and walked approximately 50 yards away to observe a group of recruits practicing river crossing techniques. This was the same type of situation that had occurred during the original prank, and it provided exactly the kind of opportunity that an enemy agent would find irresistible. Captain Hoffman approached the area casually, appearing to inspect some training equipment that was stored near the jeep. From his concealed position about 70 yards away, Master Sergeant Hayes could see that the captain was actually focusing his attention on Colonel Mitchell's clipboard. When Captain Hoffman was sure that he was not being observed, he quickly moved to the jeep and began examining the documents on the clipboard. Master Sergeant Hayes and his team photographed every moment of this activity, documenting clear evidence that Captain Hoffman was accessing classified materials without authorization. But what happened next was even more damaging to Captain Hoffman's cover story. Instead of simply glancing at the documents as an innocent person might do, he began systematically photographing each page using a small camera that he had concealed in his uniform. The surveillance team was able to photograph him in the act of taking pictures of the classified materials. The entire incident lasted less than 4 minutes, but it provided conclusive proof that Captain Hoffman was engaged in espionage activities. No innocent staff officer would carry hidden cameras or photograph classified documents during a routine training exercise. The evidence was clear, comprehensive, and legally sufficient to support serious criminal charges. But Colonel Mitchell's plan included more than just catching Captain Hoffman in the act of photographing classified documents. The real goal was to use this evidence to force the spy to reveal his communication methods and identify his contacts outside the base. This would require carefully timed confrontation and interrogation techniques that would pressure Captain Hoffman into providing information about his network. After Captain Hoffman completed his photography and moved away from the jeep, Colonel Mitchell returned to collect his clipboard as if nothing unusual had happened. He continued with the field exercise for another hour, maintaining the appearance of normal training activities while his surveillance team maintained observation of Captain Hoffman's subsequent activities. At noon, Colonel Mitchell returned to base headquarters and immediately contacted the Military Police Command Center. He reported that the surveillance operation had been successful and that conclusive evidence of espionage activity had been obtained. The next phase of the operation would involve the careful arrest and interrogation of Captain Hoffman. But before Captain Hoffman could be arrested, he needed to be isolated from potential escape routes and communication devices. The spy had been operating successfully for months, which meant he probably had established procedures for emergency situations. If he suspected that his activities had been detected, he might attempt to destroy evidence or contact his handlers for extraction. Colonel Mitchell coordinated with base security to discreetly monitor all communication facilities and transportation routes. Captain Hoffman's quarters were placed under surveillance, and his access to telephone and radio equipment was quietly restricted. These preparations would make it much more difficult for him to escape or warn his handlers if he became suspicious. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Colonel Mitchell arranged to meet with Captain Hoffman in his office, under the pretense of discussing administrative matters related to the field exercise. This meeting would provide an opportunity to assess Captain Hoffman's state of mind and determine whether he suspected that his activities had been detected. Captain Hoffman arrived at the meeting appearing relaxed and professional. He discussed the day's exercise activities in a normal manner, showing no obvious signs of stress or concern. But Colonel Mitchell, who was trained to recognize subtle behavioral indicators, noticed that the man seemed more alert than usual and was paying closer attention to his surroundings. During the conversation, Colonel Mitchell mentioned that some classified materials had been temporarily misplaced during the morning exercise but had been recovered without any apparent security breach. He watched Captain Hoffman's reaction carefully, looking for any indication that this information had special significance. Captain Hoffman's response seemed appropriately casual, but Colonel Mitchell detected a slight tension in his voice when he offered to help investigate the incident. This reaction, combined with the photographic evidence from the surveillance operation, convinced Colonel Mitchell that the time had come to confront the spy directly. At 3 o'clock, Master Sergeant Hayes and his military police team were positioned outside Colonel Mitchell's office building. Additional security personnel were stationed at key locations around the base to prevent any escape attempt. Everything was ready for the final confrontation that would either expose Captain Hoffman as an enemy agent or prove his innocence once and for all. Colonel Mitchell had conducted many interrogations during his intelligence career, but this case was particularly important because of the potential implications for ongoing Allied operations. If Captain Hoffman had been transmitting intelligence about American military activities for months, then enemy forces might have detailed information about Allied plans and capabilities. The success of the interrogation would depend on Colonel Mitchell's ability to present evidence in a way that would pressure Captain Hoffman into providing information about his network while preventing him from destroying evidence or contacting his handlers. It would require psychological skills, legal knowledge, and careful timing. As Colonel Mitchell prepared for the confrontation, he reflected on the strange series of events that had led to this moment. A simple prank by 3 young recruits had accidentally exposed one of the most dangerous security breaches in the history of Camp Harrison. Tommy Rodriguez, Billy Thompson, and Marcus Washington had unknowingly become heroes in a counterintelligence operation that could save countless Allied lives. But the operation was not over yet. The most dangerous and important phase was still ahead. At exactly 4 o'clock that Thursday afternoon, Colonel Mitchell made the decision that would end months of careful investigation and potentially save hundreds of Allied lives. He picked up his telephone and called Captain Hoffman's office, requesting that the man return immediately for an urgent discussion about security matters related to the morning's field exercise. Captain Hoffman's voice on the telephone seemed perfectly normal, but Colonel Mitchell detected a slight hesitation before the man agreed to come to headquarters. This tiny pause, lasting perhaps 2 seconds longer than natural, suggested that Captain Hoffman might be beginning to suspect that his activities had been discovered. While waiting for Captain Hoffman to arrive, Colonel Mitchell reviewed the evidence that had been gathered over the past week. The photographic documentation from the surveillance team was conclusive, showing Captain Hoffman clearly accessing classified documents and photographing them with concealed equipment. The background investigation had revealed that his identity was completely fabricated. Most importantly, the pattern of intelligence leaks from Camp Harrison matched perfectly with the timing of Captain Hoffman's assignment to the base. Master Sergeant Hayes and his team were positioned in an adjacent room, ready to provide immediate support if Captain Hoffman attempted to resist arrest or destroy evidence. Additional security personnel were stationed throughout the headquarters building and at key locations around the base perimeter. Every possible escape route had been covered. When Captain Hoffman knocked on Colonel Mitchell's door at 4:15, he appeared calm and professional. He entered the office with his usual friendly demeanor, carrying a small notebook and appearing ready to discuss routine administrative matters. But Colonel Mitchell noticed that the man's eyes moved quickly around the room, assessing exits and potential threats in a way that suggested military training beyond what would be normal for a staff officer. Colonel Mitchell invited Captain Hoffman to sit in a chair that had been positioned to prevent easy access to the door, while providing clear sight lines for the surveillance team in the adjacent room. He then began the conversation by thanking Captain Hoffman for his quick response and explaining that the security matter was more serious than he had initially realized. The interrogation that followed was a masterclass in psychological pressure and strategic revelation of evidence. Colonel Mitchell began by describing the morning's field exercise in general terms, gradually focusing on the specific incident where classified documents had been temporarily left unattended. He watched Captain Hoffman's reactions carefully, looking for signs of stress or recognition. Captain Hoffman's initial responses seemed appropriately concerned and professional. He expressed surprise that classified materials had been mishandled and offered to help investigate what had happened. But as Colonel Mitchell provided more specific details about the timing and location of the incident, Captain Hoffman began showing subtle signs of nervousness. The breakthrough came when Colonel Mitchell mentioned that the incident had been observed and documented by base security personnel. Captain Hoffman's reaction to this information was immediate and revealing. His face went pale, his hands gripped the arms of his chair more tightly, and his breathing became slightly more rapid. Colonel Mitchell then produced the first piece of photographic evidence, a clear image showing Captain Hoffman approaching the jeep where the classified documents had been placed. He laid the photograph on his desk where Captain Hoffman could see it clearly, and asked if the man could explain his presence in that location at that particular time. Captain Hoffman studied the photograph for several seconds before responding. His explanation was plausible but not convincing. He claimed that he had been inspecting training equipment stored near the jeep and had not noticed the classified documents on the clipboard. But his voice lacked conviction, and Colonel Mitchell could see that the man was beginning to realize that his situation was becoming dangerous. The second photograph was even more damaging. It showed Captain Hoffman clearly examining the documents on Colonel Mitchell's clipboard, holding them in a way that indicated deliberate study rather than casual observation. When presented with this evidence, Captain Hoffman's composure began to crack. But it was the third photograph that destroyed any possibility of maintaining his cover story. This image showed Captain Hoffman using a concealed camera to photograph the classified documents, providing conclusive proof of espionage activity. When Colonel Mitchell placed this photograph on the desk, Captain Hoffman's shoulders sagged, and he stopped trying to maintain his pretense of innocence. The confession that followed was both comprehensive and shocking. Captain Hoffman, whose real name was Klaus Heinrich, had been operating as a German intelligence agent in the United States for over 3 years. He had infiltrated the American military using forged documents and a carefully constructed false identity that had taken months of preparation to establish. Klaus Heinrich revealed that he was part of a sophisticated spy network that included agents in multiple locations across the United States. The network was coordinated by German intelligence services and was specifically designed to gather information about Allied military operations, weapons development, and strategic planning. The intelligence that Heinrich had been gathering at Camp Harrison was far more extensive than Colonel Mitchell had initially realized. For 6 months, the spy had been systematically documenting training procedures, personnel assignments, equipment shipments, and operational plans. He had been transmitting this information to his handlers using a powerful radio hidden in his private quarters. But perhaps most alarming was Heinrich's revelation that the spy network had been planning a major operation designed to disrupt Allied military activities along the entire eastern seaboard. The intelligence gathered at Camp Harrison was intended to support sabotage operations against military bases, weapons facilities, and transportation infrastructure. The false Operation Lighthouse documents that had been used to trap Heinrich had convinced him that a genuine opportunity existed to steal or destroy experimental weapons of enormous strategic value. He had already transmitted preliminary information about this fictional operation to his handlers, who were in the process of organizing a major assault on Camp Harrison designed to capture the non-existent weapons. This revelation meant that Colonel Mitchell's counterintelligence operation had accomplished far more than just capturing a single enemy agent. By feeding false information to the spy network, the trap had actually lured a significant German sabotage force into a position where they could be captured or destroyed. Heinrich provided detailed information about the planned assault, including the number of agents involved, their planned route of approach, and the timing of their attack. This intelligence allowed Colonel Mitchell to coordinate with military and civilian law enforcement agencies to prepare a comprehensive response that would eliminate the entire spy network. The assault was scheduled to take place on Sunday evening, exactly as the false documents had suggested. German agents would attempt to infiltrate Camp Harrison during a period of supposedly reduced security, planning to overwhelm the guards and steal the experimental weapons before Allied forces could respond. Instead of experimental weapons, the German agents would find a carefully prepared ambush involving military police, intelligence operatives, and combat troops from Camp Harrison. The operation that Heinrich thought would be his greatest intelligence coup would actually result in the destruction of one of Germany's most effective spy networks in the United States. As the interrogation concluded, Colonel Mitchell reflected on the remarkable chain of events that had led to this moment. 3 young recruits playing a harmless prank had accidentally exposed a security breach that threatened Allied operations throughout the region. Their innocent joke had provided the key to unraveling a sophisticated enemy intelligence operation. Tommy Rodriguez, Billy Thompson, and Marcus Washington would never know the true significance of their actions. For security reasons, they could never be told that their prank had helped capture enemy agents or prevent sabotage operations. They would always believe that they had simply gotten away with a harmless joke that had embarrassed their commanding officer. But Colonel Mitchell would never forget their accidental contribution to Allied victory. In his final report on the Heinrich case, he made sure to note that the breakthrough had come from the observational skills and innocent activities of ordinary American soldiers who had demonstrated the kind of alertness and initiative that made victory possible. The Sunday evening ambush was completely successful. 14 German agents were captured or killed when they attempted to infiltrate Camp Harrison, including Heinrich's handler, who had come personally to oversee the theft of the experimental weapons. The spy network that had been operating for over 2 years was completely eliminated, and the intelligence they had been gathering could no longer threaten Allied operations. In the weeks that followed, Heinrich provided additional information that led to the capture of enemy agents in other locations and the disruption of planned sabotage operations throughout the eastern United States. His cooperation, motivated by the hopelessness of his situation and the complete failure of his mission, probably saved hundreds of Allied lives and prevented significant damage to American military capabilities. Tommy Rodriguez, Billy Thompson, and Marcus Washington completed their basic training and were assigned to combat units preparing for deployment overseas. They remained close friends throughout the war and afterward, bound together by their shared experiences and their secret pride in having successfully pranked their strict commanding officer. They never learned that their harmless joke had accidentally made them heroes in one of the most important counterintelligence operations of World War II. They never knew that their simple prank had helped expose a dangerous enemy spy network and prevent a major sabotage operation that could have changed the course of the war. But Colonel Mitchell knew. And in the quiet moments of his later years, when he reflected on the strange ways that fate and fortune shaped the outcomes of great conflicts, he always remembered 3 young recruits who thought they were just having fun and who accidentally became the key to one of his greatest victories. The official records of the Heinrich case remain classified to this day, but the story serves as a reminder that heroes often come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most important victories are won by ordinary people who never realized the significance of their actions.